Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Film Hub NI podcast. We're delighted to see you, or maybe broadcast out to you in the world. And it's great. The sun is shining. People are going to the cinema, so we're in good fettle. And we're delighted today. We're going to take a deep dive into censorship and classification and all the people who tell you not to go to the cinema when you're 14. And so we have, as ever, Sarah.
Well, I'm delighted to be back after my last non-appearance on the podcast due to the evil COVID, but very pleased to be back.
It really wasn't. It really wasn't the same, and I mean that genuinely in many ways. The reason we're doing this podcast today is because we are supporting Imagine Festival, which is the festival of debate and politics and ideas. And they are currently screening a series of films that look at censorship, what films that are banned, films that have had a controversial opening. And part of that festival has included Dr. Sian Barber, Senior Lecturer in Film Studies at Queen's University Belfast. And we're delighted that Sian has joined us today to have a discussion.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Sian. How are you?
Good, thank you. Really good to be here.
Good. A pleasure. Are you speaking to us from Belfast, Sian?
I am, yes. I am very much in Belfast at the moment. Looking forward to getting back into the swing of things post-COVID, because I've had evil COVID as well.
You've had an evil COVID, yes. I'm the only person I know who hasn't had it. So.
That was me 2 weeks ago, so be careful.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah. I'll knock a bit of wood there. So, Sian, you're doing introductions for the films within Imagine Belfast Festival, with the titles of which are Ourselves Alone, which is a 1930s movie directed by Brian Desmond Hurst from Belfast, from Ribble Street in Belfast. Tommy, the Who musical, Hidden Figures, which is a recent film about the kind of development of kind of NASA and the involvement of African American women, and The Last Temptation of Christ, the hilarious Martin Scorsese film from the 1990s. I want to say 1990s.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't have the date off the top of my head, but yeah, that sounds about right.
And finally, the brilliant My Beautiful Laundrette by Stephen Frears. So, Sian, we just wanted to have a sort of like a general chat, really. But I'm interested. You've been working in this field for quite some time. How did you get interested in the issue of film censorship?
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I've been probably interested in this since I started. I did my PhD on 1970s British cinema. And one of the things that kept coming up was this idea of the controversial film. And of course, in that period, there's so many films which are kind of in the headlines for being, you know, challenging or pushing the boundaries and all that kind of thing, things like Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs. Yeah. And I was reading so much about them and looking back at old press reports and things like that. And then I started thinking, well, why are these films controversial? You know, is it just the fact that they've now been sort of dubbed controversial cinema, or are there particular sequences which are beyond the pale, you know, all those kind of things. And then what happened was we managed to get an in, myself and my PhD supervisor, at the British Board of Film Classification in Soho Square in London. And we were allowed to go in and actually look at some of the archival material related to those films. So, which when you're doing a PhD, anything new is fantastic. So the fact I was able to go in and actually look at that material and say, oh my goodness, this is what the problem was with Straw Dogs. That particular
right, okay. So it's so it's the kind of the detail of the personal decisions that are taken and that sort of thing,
Yeah, and actually the files themselves are fascinating, because the Bbfc, certainly in that period, were peopled by, and I'm sure they still are, be careful what I say, but sort of populated by people who loved film, who were really interested in film and cinema, and had very serious discussions about what was permitted, what wasn't permitted, what perhaps the director was trying to do. If there was a problem, could they, you know, sort of solve the problem by using a different shot or a different angle? Could they darken something? You know, and I found that process fascinating. So this idea of the censor with the scissors was, you know, quite an old dated idea, but that was the kind of the default. So what I wanted to do was sort of dig around a bit more and say, hang on a second, the BBFC, perhaps they're maybe not the big bad bear. Perhaps they're actually part of this process.
Would you have, when you first started your research, would you have seen them as the big bad bear, as like a kind of like a gatekeeper?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. These are the people who tell you what you can't see. These are the people who take all the good bits out of films. These are the people who butcher the content, and actually none of that's true. You know, they really don't. Of course, they don't do any of the cutting themselves. They send it back to the distributor and say, this is what we recommend. What you do, it's up to you. But I think to be able to dispel some of those myths was really interesting, and to look at those well-known films and find a lot of other films which were perhaps less well-known but which still ran into trouble. I just find that really fascinating.
So
total censorship dork.
Well, we're glad that somebody is. But I mean, it is a fascinating area. I mean, if you take a title like Ourselves Alone, how did that get affected by censorship? How was that?
Oh, right. A bit of a lengthy story. So if it starts getting long-winded, then by all means cut me off. Made in 1936 by Brian Desmond Hurst. He wanted very much to make a love story set in 20s Ireland, with the background of sort of this very troubled, difficult period. What happened was the film was passed by the Bbfc in London. They gave it an A certificate, A for adult. They didn't see any problems with it. They thought that it dealt with the politics quite sensitively. The issue was when it came to play in Belfast. It was actually seen at a press screening by a unionist politician who said, "This is Sinn Féin propaganda, can't have this, blah, blah, blah." And so the long and short of it is that they stepped in and they prevented the film being shown in the city. The local council did, Belfast Council. And in doing so, they actually invoked the Special Powers Act, which was a piece of political legislation which had never been used to censor a film before. It's a piece of legislation that only applies to Northern Ireland, and this was the piece of legislation they thought was appropriate to say, no to this film. Right. So it's quite a tricky case.
And so it was banned in Belfast.
Yep.
But not everywhere, I suppose. There were places could screen it.
There were places that could screen it, but the way that local censorship tends to work, especially in regions, is that people look to sort of the bigger towns and cities to take the lead. If you're going to show it, if you're not going to show it in Belfast, for example, why would you then screen it in, Newry or Derry or Strabane? So they're all in touch with each other. They're all trying to sort of take the temperature. But Ourselves Alone, made obviously only about 10 years after the events that it actually depicts, maybe 15 years, was felt to be too sort of politically divisive.
Right.
Yeah, I think ironically what Hurst was trying to do was present something even-handed, but what he actually ended up doing was irritating everybody, in that brilliant way that you try and please everybody and you end up pleasing nobody.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, Sarah? It's really interesting. What Hugh and I were, when we were kind of prepping for this yesterday, something that I hadn't really thought about was the films in context, like not necessarily the content of them, and something that probably a lot of people know, I didn't know, but about Casablanca being banned in Ireland because of new sensitivities around neutrality in the war, and then it was re-released, but only if they cut out any romance, because that would offend Irish Catholic morality. So, but yet it would have, obviously wider releases. So,
she was married to another fella.
Yeah, well, can't be having that in them days. But that's a really interesting thing about how we, the default position is, that film must have violence, sex, language, whatever it is, but actually it's the context and release is
absolutely.
Really,
and that's kind of what I find really fascinating too, Sarah. That's exactly it. The idea that it's not just all sex and violence, it's all that kind of nuance about context and content and how it's going to play in different regions. And language is a huge trigger, racial language, sexualized language. It's a real problem. And often you can't cut it without completely dismantling a scene. So it's really, really tricky to think how that's going to affect what you actually put on the screen. So
yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, there's a sort of call for a lot of retrospective censorship now. In terms of problematic films in the past that couldn't really be shown without censorship, or there's a debate around use of racial language, those kind of things which were pertinent to the time and probably in general usage at the time, and now wouldn't be acceptable.
Well, it's how you sanitize the past, isn't it? At what point do you just have to say this was the past, this was an interpretation of past events, or a film made in a particular period where these kind of views were commonplace, or this kind of language was not necessarily acceptable but in common use. But then you're presenting it to a modern audience. How do you do that? And it's going to sound very jarring. I mean, there was that big kickoff a couple of years ago, wasn't there, about Gone with the Wind, and the way that it presents slavery, the kind of the stereotype of the happy slave and all this other kind of thing. How do you actually present that to a modern audience without making it ridiculous? Yeah,
because I mean, as people who support cinema operators, we're always talking about contextualizing all material that you show, but I mean, often often that doesn't necessarily prevent offense. So, you know, I'm thinking of like some of the really heavy Westerns that I've seen down the years and things like that. You know, there's some very difficult stuff there. In fact, I was reading about Soldier Blue.
Oh, yeah.
Film from the 1970s, was a very hardcore kind of revisionist Western about the Cheyenne and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, that would be really quite problematic to screen now, you know, just in terms of the way that it presents. But the makers of the film were trying to make a point about, you know, the treatment of American Indians and First Nations and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's very tricky.
It is tricky, and I think you run into these murky waters, don't you, where it's very easy for a director or a producer or a company to argue this is what we're trying to do, but you have no control over how those messages are going to be received, how people are going to respond and react. And that's when I find all those really odd, weird, quirky cases when people take issue with particular things that you know were never even seen as being problematic when the script was being developed or when the film was being shot.
Yeah.
So what is the just back to the basic, the process of getting films classified? What are the stages of that?
It's a system that's been in place since basically 1912. The system is still the same. You make a film, you submit your film to the BBFC. They charge you a fee, usually based on how long it is, and then they recommend what certificates it will be. Okay, so it's a really basic process, or that part of it's quite basic, and it means that they can be independent of funding. You know, they don't get subsidized by the government or anything like that. They are literally paid by the film trade. So after that, the company can either choose to accept the certificate, which I would say the majority do, or the BBFC operates a slightly different system now where they can advise a cut to category. So they can say, as it stands at the moment, it's a 15. However, if you want the 12, you do this, 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 and this. Take your pick. And that's interesting because it puts the onus back on the company, because that's what they did with the Hunger Games. You know, they said it's a 15, take the 15, or you can make these changes. And of course, they made the changes because they did not want to lose out on that lucrative 12 to 15 box office. So they're part of the process. It's not necessarily that they're being heavy-handed, but they're saying, this is where the industry is, this is where the audience is, this is what we think.
And I mean, obviously, a lot of the controversies come from local councils as well.
Yes,
maybe
very much so.
Could you explain how that works? That you know, in terms of, we often think of the BBFC as being the final arbiter, but actually, it's on the ground as well.
Definitely, they recommend. It's all very strangely couched in terms of language. They recommend. We think you should take the 15. We think this film is a 12. We think this film is an 18. And then the actual local councils are responsible for ensuring that that is the certificate that the film gets, because they grant the exhibition licenses in their local jurisdiction. So essentially, if they disapprove, they can withhold the exhibition license and say, we're not going to give an exhibition license to that film, or we're going to put a special caveat in the license that says you can show it, but you have to show it in a higher category. Okay, so the BBFC gave it a 12, we're going to overrule it and say it has to be a 15. So a lot of the time they don't get involved. A lot of the time it's fairly standard as a process, but it's when they do get involved, that's when it gets really, really messy, because then you've got different people weighing in and making all kinds of different decisions.
There's some famous cases in Belfast. So Frankenstein is a good example, or
Frankenstein. There's loads of different ones, and I think certain councils get the reputation for being quite censorious, quite prudish, quite sort of morally conservative. It's an important power that they have, and there have been moments when the government has had an opportunity to sort of take that power back and give it very firmly within legislation to the BBFC, and they haven't done it. It's always been that idea that this is a power for local authorities to impose if they choose to do so.
Well, I suppose I wonder whether it's because often sort of cinema license and exhibition license is a health and safety issue.
Yes.
You know, it's very often, you know, you have to kind of have the right appropriate amounts of fire exits and you know, all those kind of things. So I wonder whether if they split it where it's about content and, you know, and you just deal with the building safety, I wonder whether that's the sort of thing councils push back against. I'm not sure.
I think it's a lot of paperwork, and it's an awful lot of work. If you start involving yourself in content decisions, you know, that's massive. Who's going to do that? Who's going to run it? How are you going to make sure that all the films that you're making decisions about you've seen? You know, what premises are you going to hire in order to do that? Who's going to manage all the paperwork? Who's going to make the decisions? You know, it's a massive amount of work. Once you start it, it's incredibly hard to stop.
but it does have that sort of, sorry, Sarah, it does have that sort of odd thing where Last Tango in Paris, for example, was banned at Belfast, but you were able to go to Bangor to watch it.
Yeah, I know. It creates a really bonkers system which is all about location and geography. Essentially, which doesn't really make any sense, because you're not restricting access to a particular film, you're just making it harder for people to go and see it, because you're encouraging them to go somewhere else.
Although the Tonic Cinema in Bangor did very well out of it, I believe.
I'm sure it did. Yeah, absolutely. Doesn't it always come down to money?
Somebody always makes some money somewhere.
Oh yeah.
Just as we were talking about councils here, there's been a couple of things recently in Belfast that are quite interesting. The first is there's an Irish language film called Foscadh, which they couldn't. There was a time issue with a release, with getting a Bbfc classified for release up here, because it was being released in the south, and the council granted Eclipse Pictures the license to the cinemas, to screen it in Belfast Council. It's slightly too late for the run, but I think they will do that, which is kind of it was a short term, it was made very quickly, that decision, which was interesting. And then that came on the back of there's been a lot of chat about the Batman, which I haven't seen, so I can't comment on the actual Batman himself, but in terms of in the south, there's a 15A classification, but the movie house have had previous issues with the same sort of, with the film being a 15 here and 15A. People can cross the border, from Derry to go and see it in Letterkenny, no problem. And their case was that their staff were getting abused or whatever, so the city council granted them the license to show the Batman as a 15A only, so that only covered city side, really, not their other sites. But those are two things that have happened quite close together in Belfast. It's a bit
it's fascinating, isn't it, when they all start to bubble up and appear at the same time. I think the first case that you're talking about, I think is really good, and that happens quite a lot with festival films. If they haven't been through the BBFC, or if they're sort of part of a program which hasn't been through that formal process yet, often things can be waived, and you often see it at festivals where it's like, this film has not yet received a certificate because it's not on general release yet. So councils have that important power as well, which I think is really good, because it means that they can support filmmaking locally, they can support films of local interest, they can say it's not just about commercial film making money, we're quite keen to support the kind of the arts and culture and the heritage here. The Batman case is completely different. Oh boy, I've been so excited about this. I'm such a dork, like I said. Because actually what they're doing is a really slippery slope. Like I said, when you start to weigh in as a local authority or a local council on issues of film generally, and particularly of film classification, you're opening up a huge can of worms, especially if you're being seen to bow to economic pressure, which is essentially what's happened here. And, that's not to be anti-commerce. Obviously, we all want cinemas to make money. We all want people to go back to the cinema. But what you're basically saying is a number of key things. You're basically saying that the BBFC have got the certification wrong. Okay, they're being too stringent with the 15. You're adopting a completely new certificate, which doesn't fit within the British system at all. As you say, Sarah, the 15A is an Irish certificate, not a British one. And a lot of people seem to be quite confused about what 15A actually is. I've had people contact me saying, gosh, Belfast Council at it again, making things harder. And you're like, actually, they're making things easier, because this makes 15 and under, not 15 and over. So there's a misunderstanding about that. But the other thing as well is that, where do you stop that process then? If you've bowed to pressure once, aren't you now saying it's open season? Anybody who has a film that they really want to show that they don't agree with the classification, can't they now appeal to the local council and say, would you take a look at this one? Would you take a look at that one? It's really, really fascinating that they've chosen to do this.
And quite publicly too, Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I heard from Michael McAdam, who owns the Movie House Cinemas, at a meeting where one of his concerns was staff safety. And one of the reasons, I think it was Venom, the film Venom, which I haven't obviously watched, but I think there was issues around like parents expecting to be able to bring their child in and watch it with them, or whatever the case might be. and staff were saying, no, it's a 15, they can't come in, you know, all the usual kind of rules apply and things. And I think it was the 15, the idea was that the 15A would give more wriggle room for, you know, for exhibitors in that sense. And Michael's argument to a certain extent was, you know, with streaming, it's, you know, cinemas are under pressure in terms of there's, you know, you can watch it in the house. So if, you know, cinemas are in that difficult position where actually streaming means that your access to it is wide open at home, but your access to it in the cinema is marshaled and governed. So are the two are the two experiences entirely different? You know, is it different watching it in person than it is in house?
I think it's really, really tricky. I think the experience of watching is different, and I think the streaming argument makes it really changes the debate actually, because he's absolutely right. You know, we do monitor a lot less carefully. There's a lot less regulation around streamed content or material that you watch at home. There always has been. I think just picking up on one last point about the Batman is that it's also a very strange film to present as now it's a family film, or now it's a film which is suitable for a family viewing experience. Because again, that kind of opens the door for all superhero films to be presented in that particular way, or all 15s at a 15, which can now be presented in that way. Okay, so that's it. Again, like I said, it's a really, really slippery slope. They're going to have to be really quite clear, and I can see them having to issue very particular guidance and guidelines on what they mean by what is acceptable and what they mean is suitable, or is it just for this film? Anyway, but yeah, I think
it does worry me slightly. I mean, Belfast City Council have always been a bit, they'll get involved and then they'll withdraw and say it's nothing to do with us, sort of thing. And I do worry that they won't have the resources to be able to manage that process, or that, you know, just in a wider thing. I don't know. A quick question I wanted to ask was just about the impact of technology on censorship, because obviously, I mean, you two are much younger than I would, but I remember the video nasties kind of thing, you know, with Evil Dead and all that sort of stuff that happened, and the Bulger case as well, around, you know, kind of like with the judge actually calling out, you know, video nasties as being one of the causes and things like that. How does it always have an impact? You know, new technology seems to just throw a grenade into the middle of the kind of, you know, agreed things, and I suppose that's what's happening now with streaming as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Hugh. And I think everything that you just mentioned, what's fascinating about it is that every kind of new technological iteration or innovation, that the debate doesn't change. The censorship debate fundamentally stays exactly the same, but the fear is different. So it's just a case, it's still about protecting children, protecting the vulnerable, people getting access to things that they shouldn't, the ability or the potential ability for such material to be corrupting, to be upsetting, all those kind of things. That language is just kind of wheeled out every single time there's a new concern. So the debate doesn't change. The technology does change. And certainly when VHS sort of hit the market, it was fascinating. And again, if you look back at the Bbfc files, you see the notes for the film release, but you also see the notes for the video releases as well. And often the concerns and anxieties about the content are different, because it's the idea that it's not just this is what's in the film, it's the fact that this is what's in the film that somebody could be watching on their own at home in a darkened room over and over and over again. So there were real fears about that kind of cumulative effect. But also the other thing, which I still find really amusing, I probably shouldn't, but the rewind button, that was felt to be a real challenge, because the idea that if there was a sort of a gory bit or a horrible bit or a sexy bit, somebody could literally rewind it and watch it again and again and again by themselves. And that was seen as a really damaging. And you're just thinking, if that's not going to damage someone, you know, maybe they were slightly damaged already, if that's what they're choosing to do. It's
you know, this isn't a confessional, but I can tell you that did happen.
I'm sure it did. But if the idea that any kind of legislation or anything that could be put in place to sort of limit that is, I just find that very, very funny.
There's a famous quote from James Furman where he was watching a film with a group of kind of, you know, at the NFT, or you know, what is now BFI South Bank, where he said, you know, it's all very well for you educated middle class cineasts to watch this, but not, you know, what if it got into the hands of a truck driver from Manchester, you know? And I wonder whether there's a class element to it, and knowing what's good for the masses is definitely an element in all this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a big thread in censorship anyway, the idea that, you know, going back to the sort of almost the Lady Chatterley lover case with the novel, the whole, but would you let the servants read it? You know, it's the idea that, like you said, middle class people can handle things. Working class people need to be protected. So there is that almost sort of benevolent paternalism that certainly runs as a thread throughout the BBFC's decision-making processes since they were created.
Yeah, because things like Battleship Potemkin. But what's it? I always find it very interesting that, you know, if you look at the roots of the Film Society movement, there's a get out clause around classification, in that if you have a members screening, and actually the QFT is still officially a membership organization, because it was started to show private screenings of specific films. And if it's unclassified, then if you're a member, if you do it as a member screening, then you can get away with it. You can essentially show anything. So, for example, Battleship Potemkin was shown in the Houses of Parliament Film Society, which was an early kind of version. But a lot of the film societies that have sprung up right across England was because they wanted to access films that weren't being classified.
Absolutely. And a lot of the time that isn't necessarily extreme things in terms of sexual violence, but it might be what would be termed sort of radical politics and things like that. So that loophole is still very much in evidence. And I've been to stuff at the QFT where you look at your ticket and you think, oh, this is a members screening. That's a bit weird. Okay. You know, but you realize it's still a very powerful loophole. So with all this stuff about censorship, with all the different sort of legislation that's put in place, both nationally and locally, there's all these different ways that people get involved, and as a mechanism for saying, well, we're kind of going to use the system this way, we're going to kind of make sure that the system works for us. I was in Bradford recently in the archive, and there was a complaint about some of the films that were being screened by a film club, by a film society, from some of the sort of Indian, Pakistan merchants in the city that basically got together and founded a film club. And some of them were saying they're showing politically motivated material. And the council was very much like, yeah, that is nothing to do with us. They're a film club, they're a society, they can show whatever they want. You know, but again, it's fascinating that they play hands off when it suits them. And yet, when it doesn't suit them, they kind of weigh in on different things.
Okay, so just before we wrap up, a last question. There's been a lot of talk in the media over the last wee while about the online safety bill and threatening freedom of speech and all that. What do you think what do you think the influence of that would be on the climate of censorship online?
Oh, I think it's really, really difficult, because you're trying to limit something, you're trying to restrict something, maybe with the best intentions in the world, but the way in which it's being done, I think, is incredibly heavy-handed. It's too prescriptive. It's not designed, the internet is not designed, and this kind of material is not designed to be controlled by legislation, essentially.
Or algorithms.
Absolutely. I mean, how are you going to ensure that somebody, for example, writing a research article, somebody who's interested in writing an essay or putting together a film festival and has to search for things or find things online, isn't going to be sort of flagged as looking at inappropriate content or running inappropriate searches? And I know that there's a whole spectrum of things that it's trying to protect, or a whole sort of litany of crimes or offences that it's trying to detect. But I don't think a single piece of legislation can do that. And I don't think a lot of the motivation is very well understood in this particular bill. Like I said, I haven't been through it in any detail. I just feel very anxious about it, because I think it is against freedom of speech. I think you are trying to police something which essentially you can't.
I mean, I suppose we, in the early days of the internet, this sort of thing would just not have been possible. You know, the old Wild West kind of era and things. Now that the internet is so aggregated, you know, in terms of Facebook, Google, you know, we all have ways in, and it's sort of controlled. I wonder whether, you know, trying to put legislation that controls those big companies is one thing. There will always be a Wild West underneath it. And a lot of the language does remind me of the video nasty sort of stuff, where there's a small amount of evidence is extrapolated out into a wide-ranging kind of, you know, the society is falling apart, and, you know, and if we don't get control of this, then really awful things are going to happen.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scaremongering that's being whipped up in certain parts of the press as well about how we need this legislation, because, as you say, otherwise society is going to completely collapse in on itself and our children will be exposed to these horrific things. I mean, yes and no. Like I said, the debate doesn't essentially change that much, but I think marshalling that kind of language and those kind of fear tactics. So it's very, very dangerous, because you're basically then green lighting a lot of very, very heavy-handed political activity, because of course this is political. You know, what's the kind of material that's going to be cracked down upon? You know?
Yeah, well, yeah. Ban this sick filth. That's what I say. Ban this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also a lot of the research, you know, you mentioned the research into all of this. You know, when I'm teaching this kind of material, I always kind of talk to my students and just say, can we actually prove, if you see this, you will go and do that? You know, there may be an indication, there may be a suggestion, but can you tell me if you see this, then this will follow? You know, do violent films make people violent? Do funny films make people funny? It's, you know, when you boil it down, it comes down to a really, really unscientific set of claims, which is very frustrating.
Sort of an instinctive thing that, you know, kind of what we see influences what we do. I mean, you know, yeah. I think it's a fascinating world. I mean, I think of all the governments in the world to be managing this, that this is probably not the one that I'd recommend. I mean, no. But I do sort of feel that this is a natural piece of history. You know, technology comes along, it changes everything, and then retrospectively we try to kind of retrofit rules and laws to kind of control it. And I suppose you could talk about that about cinema, you know, with the Hays Code and you know, all the stuff that happened in Hollywood. Around sort of, you know, I mean, I think the first British film that was banned was one about giving prisoners ideas about coming out of or escaping from prison or something like that.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
So absolutely. It's very difficult, because you can see that perhaps the pure motivations, but at the same time you think, oh, you're chasing the dragon. You know, you're trying to put something in place which is going to just wrestle this back into the bottle, and I don't think it'll work. One thing that I did think was quite an interesting innovation was the Netflix adopting the Bbfc classifications, you know, for all their content, which I think is really interesting, because most people just kind of saw it, accepted it, moved on, you know, whereas actually it's a huge extension of their remit.
Yeah, of course.
You know, this is material that's never been submitted to them, but they're now classifying it. And again, one of my students raised it quite recently. They said, well, what if it's an old film? You know, does it have the old classical Bbfc rating on it, or have they looked at it again and given it a more modern rating? I have no idea, because
is Heather's a 12 now? I don't know.
Oh God, it keeps moving around, doesn't it?
Yeah. Things were a lot simpler when I worked in a video shop in the 1990s, you know.
Really? Yeah. If you can reach it, you can buy it. That sort of thing. Is that kind of how it works?
Well, that's exactly it. But I think the form of cinema, just to pontificate a little bit, you know, the way in which we watch has changed so much. You know, it isn't just the go, because I remember those days, well, go to the video shop, you know, that was your choice. That was what you got off the shelf. That was what you took home. You know, even when you went to the pictures, you saw what was on. You know, you didn't sit at home in front of Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever and have a massive, enormous choice of different things that you could consume. So yeah, maybe it's just the inevitability of there's so much content. There needs to be a broader means of thinking how that content is out there. Yeah.
Sian, we're very grateful for your time. It's really fascinating kind of to take a little tiptoe through this world, because I think it is a world that really impacts on us, and you know, these are important things that we need to think about, and cinema exhibitors especially, you know, and how they contextualize material. So Sian, thank you very much. You mentioned some research that's coming up in the next couple of years. Is that mentioned at all?
Oh, my research, my goodness, when I ever get away to do any. Yeah, so basically I'm looking into local film censorship. I've been working on censorship for about sort of 10, 15 years now, but I'm really starting to dig down into what happens in different local areas. So spreading the net as wide as I can, digging around in local council archives and just seeing what their issues were, what they're interested in. That's why I was in Bradford recently, and I'm going to be in Cumbria actually next week, if all goes according to plan. Yeah, so it's nice. It's good to get a sense of it's not just London with the BBFC, and it's not just this very sort of homogenized idea of the regions, you know, because obviously all locations are different. So a lot of archival work, but yeah, it's really fascinating, some of the stuff I'm finding out. So watch this.
Please come back and talk to us about it when you're done.
Oh, I'd love to. You never shut me up about it. That's the problem.
Well, thank you very much, Sian, and we'll catch up with you soon.
That's brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Sian Barber from Film Studies at Queen's. Really fascinating to walk through censorship and what it means, because it is obviously an important issue that will only become more important. But now, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone out there, this is the time for Sarah Gunn's Film Roundup. Sarah, we missed you last time. I was a pale photocopy of your quality and thoroughness. So if you would.
Very good job.
If you would take us by the hand and lead us through cinema land, we'd be very grateful.
Oh,
what's coming up? What's coming up?
Well, indeed, I'm delighted to be back to tell all the people about all the films. Now the sun is shining outside, so now it's time to get into a dark room and watch films. Just to pick up on the Imagine Festival, you were looking at the dates there, so I have the list of them here. If anybody is interested in going as part of that festival, it's all linked to what Sian was talking about with the censorship. Tommy is tonight, 22nd of March. My beautiful laundrette. Yes, sing along.
Can you hear me?
Right. My beautiful laundrette is tomorrow the 23rd. That's a QFT. Hidden Figures is on the 24th at the Strand. Emulator, an experimental film, is on the 26th at the Vault Art Studios in East Belfast. And then the last film is back over to the QFT on the 27th with Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, which I have down here as 1988. You were looking for the date earlier for that. 1988.
Right.
So that is the Imagine Festival covered. Young Plato. There's been a lot of chat about that film, that documentary set in Ardoyne recently. IFTA winning and a lot of festival wins for this documentary.
In Greece.
That's why I didn't say that. Yeah. It won at a Greek documentary festival. And there's a chance to see that over at the Strand and at the Movie House City Side from 22nd, 24th of March. And we are really pleased that our friends up the Seaside Portrush Film Theatre are coming back to screenings after some we don't say venue issues. The venue's getting updated, so it will be good. No real issues, just not a venue to screen in. But they're coming back with Young Plato on this Thursday, the 24th of March, also.
And that's at the film theatre, the usual venue.
Yeah, so they're currently screening in a room in the bar while the theatre's getting, but which should hopefully be they should be back in there by June, July. But they have a few things up their sleeve coming back just to keep the independent film audiences of Portrush satisfied with their lot. Ormeau Community Cinema have a free screening at Balnafie Methodist Church this Saturday of Encanto. There's a lot of Encanto in this whole roundup. I mean, they could be singing. We don't talk about Bruno. No, okay, no more singing. So that's this Saturday. Newcastle Community Cinema on Sunday have Encanto. Right. And Censor, the film with Niamh Algar, on April 1st. Film. Yeah. Yes. And Niamh Algar is brilliant. And Censor, that's all linked into our censorship again. I've just realised that. Very good. They have West Side Story, Spielberg's one, on April the 9th, and Petite Maman on April the 12th.
Oh yeah, if anybody is listening and in that area, go and see Petite Maman because it's a fantastic film.
Yeah.
I mean the kind of film that you walk away and kind of go, I could watch that again because it was so good.
Would you go to Newcastle again to watch it?
I did flick through my head there, yeah.
Yeah. I'll report back. Okay, and Fermanagh Film Club have got a couple of things coming up. I Am Not a Witch on the 30th of March, and Memory Box, which is really interesting, on the 13th of April, and they're all at the Ardoyne.
Memory Box is a really interesting film about Lebanese immigrants in Montreal and the kind of war in Beirut in the 1980s and things. It really sounds, it's intergenerational history, but really fascinating.
Really good. Again, Fermanagh Film Club knocking it out of the park, as they say, with their excellent programming.
Heroes.
We love those guys. Another community cinema which is popping up again is the Picture House at Ballyclare. They've been away for a little while, but they're joining in the collective tour. This is the final screening of Wildfire. This has been running from the start of February, and this Saturday, 26th of March, is screening at the Town Hall in Ballyclare. Really pleased they're taking part in this, and we should say as well that there will be news on the next collective tour in the next podcast. A very exciting title we're working on. I'm not saying anything yet, but there will be lots of good things happening on that tour.
Will there be joy? Will there be joy everywhere?
Oh, there'll be psychological thrilling.
Blimey.
I'll just leave it there.
Say no more.
Yeah. Cinemagic, our friends who do great things for the young people, are back with their, well, the On the Pulse Festival has been running for a while, and it's running now until the 29th of March. And one thing I've picked out from that is they have a horror short film evening on the 26th of March in the Black Box called Are You Sitting Comfortably? Oh. I mean, the seats in the Black Box are pretty comfortable, so they should be fine. But that looks really interesting. But everything else is on their website. Walled Cities 4. This is an interesting short film season. Not short films, sorry.
No,
it's a short season of films. In the QFT in April, exploring political conflict in divided communities and walled cities around the world, featuring screenings including Girafada, I might have said that right, but Smuggling Hendrix and Rabbit a la Berlin, and loads of guest speakers. And their theme for 2022 is the impact of conflict on animals and children. Obviously quite relevant and with current things, even though this was programmed well before any things that was going on now. That looks really interesting. So that's, you can have a look on the QFT website. That's all taking place in April. And another festival, the Foil Festival at the Nerve Centre are back in Derry for the, let me get this right, the 16th Foil Film Intercultural and Anti-Racism Festival. It's quite a long name, had to read that, couldn't remember it. Which is running from the 20th of March to the 29th of April, and it has titles to suit everyone.
It's a really big, lot of screening and a lot of stuff that you may have missed at the cinema.
Yeah, including Kenny B's Belfast. Could
Kenny
be
B.
an Oscar winner by then.
The B-Man. Well, if he gets that isolation, you know what I mean?
Oh, poor Kenny B.
Just him and Kieran Hines in a hotel suite, just in their pants, set to day 7. Day 7.
Well, the people of Derry can watch the sequel of Belfast. Derry is the sequel of Belfast. No, it's not. And Viva La Vida, the tragedy of Macbeth, which
it's really worth seeing. Yep,
it is incredible. I'll not bring Stephen Mullen, our producer, into that because he'll be on for ages talking about how good it is. Because him and I have discussed it quite length.
Right, yeah.
It's a fantastic screen, a brilliant film. And After Love, which is great to see it, and I know it's coming back to QFT for a couple of screenings as well. Of course, Joanna Scanlon recently won a BAFTA last week.
She did. And rightly so. It's a fantastic, I mean, it's a really good film, but her performance is just wonderful in it. So.
Yeah, and she beat Lady Gaga to that BAFTA, and she deserved it rightly.
Joanna that's big talk from you, because you're very much a Gaga. I believe the kids call them stans. Is that the right word I'm looking for?
Yes.
Yeah? You're a Gaga stan.
Yes.
Yeah.
I am, but I do believe. Do I have what?
Do you have a Twitter account?
No, I don't.
Lady Gaga?
No, I don't. I'm not.
Okay, maybe that's the next step.
I'm 41 here. You don't have time for Twitter stan accounts of Lady Gaga.
41 too. Do you know what I mean? I mean, do you ever see like when Katrina Belfast stan accounts? What the?
Oh
what?
yeah.
People, calm down.
There are some individuals out there.
Yeah, I know.
A lot of them. And the Jimmy Dornan ones as well. Anyway,
Robert Carlyle, there's hundreds of them. Anyway, sorry, we are digressing here. Back to Derry and back to the Nerve Centre.
Yeah, we should do a podcast on weird stands of actors sometime. Anyway, carry on. So yes, After Love, go and see that. And then for the children, we have Encanto again. They're not talking about Bruno up in Derry or Newcastle or here. And Clifford the Big Red Dog, which I've also seen. Pure classic. And these screens are taking place in the Nerve Centre itself and the Brunswick Movie Bowl, but go to all their websites. Some of the stuff's on our website as well, but there's a lot taking place over the next month.
Okay. Well, that all sounds really great, and there's plenty of independent cinema to get out and to see, and we're delighted to see it all happening.
We are.
Yeah, I mean that Nerve Centre Festival is always really good for catching things that you didn't see when when it first came around in the cinema and stuff. So very, very worth checking out on their website, and our website will cover everything else, I think. Well, thank you, Sarah. Always a pleasure. From your South Belfast eyrie up there in the hills. And thank you as ever to our glamorous production producer, Stephen Mullen, who makes it all work so well. So we'll be back in April with another podcast. We don't quite know what that's going to be about, but we'll make it up as we go along and do
It'll be brilliant. It
will be brilliant, 100% brilliant. Yeah, by anybody's standard. Objectively brilliant, perhaps. And so, yeah, so we'll see you then. And until then, keep watching films. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.